A little beggar saved the life of a millionaire woman on the street when she asked him what she wanted as a reward. The millionaire fainted upon hearing the child's answer. In the bustling heart of Manhattan, a powerful businesswoman finds her perfectly controlled world shattered when a mysterious boy crosses her path. What begins as a chance encounter soon unravels into a journey through buried secrets, betrayal, and a fight for justice. As the boy's past collides with her present, their bond becomes the key to unlocking a truth that could change everything. What did he reveal that made her risk it all? And how far will she go to protect him? Eleanor Rivers moved swiftly through the crowded streets of Manhattan, her heels clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that matched her relentless pace. She barely noticed the people she brushed past, her focus fixed entirely on the glowing screen of her phone. Her mind raced with thoughts of upcoming meetings and pressing deadlines, leaving no room for the world around her. The cacophony of the city faded into the background as she typed furiously with one hand, her other gripping a sleek leather bag. She approached a busy intersection, her gaze never lifting from her phone. The light had turned red for pedestrians, but Eleanor didn't notice. Her thoughts were too loud, drowning out the noise of car engines revving impatiently. A blaring horn shattered her focus, followed by a piercing scream. Eleanor froze, her mind too slow to process what was happening. The screech of tires on asphalt made her heart skip a beat as she realized she was in the middle of the street. Time seemed to slow as she glanced up and saw a car barreling toward her. Before she could react, a small, firm hand grabbed her arm and yanked her backward. Eleanor stumbled, her heels catching on the curb as she felt her knees on the sidewalk. The car sped past, missing her by inches. For a moment, she sat there, gasping for air, her chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through her veins. Her vision focused on the figure standing before her. It was a boy, no older than 10, with messy dark hair and clothes that looked as though they hadn't been washed in days. His wide eyes met hers, filled with a maturity that didn't match his age. He wasn't frightened or panicked. Instead, he seemed almost calm, as if saving a stranger's life were something he did every day. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady but soft. Eleanor nodded, though her hands trembled as she pushed herself up. She dusted off her designer suit, her movements stiff and mechanical. She wasn't accustomed to losing control, and the near-death experience had left her shaken in a way she couldn't articulate. "I'm fine," she managed, her voice tinged with irritation more than gratitude. "You saved me." The boy offered a small smile, but said nothing. His silence unnerved her, and she felt compelled to do something to regain her composure. Opening her bag, she pulled out a crisp $100 bill and extended it to him. "Here," she said, her tone firm. "Take this." The boy looked at the money for a moment before shaking his head. "I don't want money." His words hit her like a physical blow. Eleanor blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. "What do you mean you don't want money? Everyone needs money." "I just wanted to help," he replied simply. "That's all." Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to reconcile his actions with his words. She had spent years in a world where everything had a price, where kindness was transactional and gratitude was measured in monetary value. This boy, standing barefoot on the gritty sidewalk, had just saved her life and expected nothing in return. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Ethan," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Well, Ethan," she began, her tone regaining some of its usual authority, "you can't just wander around the city like this. Where are your parents?" "I don't have any," he replied, his voice even but tinged with a quiet acceptance that made her chest tighten. Eleanor hesitated. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but his answer left her unsettled. She glanced around, as if hoping someone would step forward and claim him, but the street buzzed with indifferent passers-by. "Where do you live?" she asked, shifting her weight uncomfortably. "Nowhere," he said with a shrug. "I go where I need to." Her initial instinct was to walk away. She had meetings to attend, problems to solve, and a life that didn't have room for stray children. But something in Ethan's gaze rooted her to the spot. It wasn't desperation or fear. It was something else entirely, an odd mixture of curiosity and resilience that made her pause. "You should come with me," she said, the words leaving her mouth before she could fully think them through. Ethan tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see right through her. "Why?" "Because," Eleanor faltered. "Why, indeed?" She didn't owe him anything beyond a thank you, yet the idea of leaving him there felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. "Because you saved my life. It's the least I can do." He considered her offer for a moment before nodding. "Okay." As they walked toward her car, parked a few blocks away, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a decision that would ripple through her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Ethan followed her silently, his small figure incongruous against the towering skyscrapers that loomed overhead. Eleanor opened the door to the sleek black car and gestured for Ethan to get in. He climbed into the back seat, his movements careful as he surveyed the plush interior. She slid into the front, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to ask. As the car pulled away from the curb, Eleanor glanced at Ethan in the rearview mirror. He sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the world outside the window, as if memorizing every detail. "Where are we going?" he asked after a long silence. "My house," Eleanor replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "We'll figure things out from there." Ethan didn't respond, but his expression softened, and for the first time since she met him, Eleanor felt a glimmer of something she couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was relief, or maybe it was the beginning of an understanding that neither of them yet fully grasped. The city blurred past them, and Eleanor's thoughts flickered between the life she had meticulously built and the boy who had just walked into it. For the first time in years, she felt a crack in the armor she had so carefully constructed, and she wasn't sure whether to be afraid or grateful. The car rolled to a smooth stop in front of Eleanor Rivers' sprawling mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. The estate, with its manicured lawns and towering columns, stood as a testament to her success. A sharp contrast to the small, disheveled figure sitting quietly in the back seat. Ethan had said nothing during the drive, but his silence wasn't unsettling. It felt measured, as though he were studying his surroundings with a mix of curiosity and restraint. Eleanor stepped out first, smoothing her blazer and opening the car door for him. "Come on," she said, motioning for him to follow. Ethan hesitated briefly before climbing out, his bare feet barely making a sound on the smooth stone driveway. He craned his neck, taking in the grandeur of the mansion. His expression remained unreadable, though his wide eyes betrayed a hint of amazement. "This is where you live?" he asked finally, his voice low. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her tone brisk. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to downplay it, but something about his quiet all made her uncomfortable. "Come inside." As they entered, the marble foyer seemed to swallow Ethan in its vastness. The high ceilings and gleaming floors reflected the late afternoon sunlight, casting an almost ethereal glow. Ethan stood awkwardly, his hands in his pockets, while Eleanor set down her bag and instructed her housekeeper, Grace, to prepare something for him to eat. Ethan shifted on his feet as Eleanor turned back to him. "You can sit," she said, gesturing to a plush sofa in the living room. He nodded but didn't move, his eyes darting around the room as though he didn't quite believe he belonged there. She sighed and sat across from him, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. "All right, Ethan," she began, her voice softening. "I need to know more about you. Where have you been living?" "Mostly on the streets," he said plainly, his gaze meeting hers. "And before that," he hesitated then shrugged, "an orphanage." The simplicity of his answer tightened something in Eleanor's chest. She tried to imagine what it must have been like for him, but the thought felt too abstract, too far removed from her reality. "What about your parents?" she asked cautiously. Ethan's expression changed subtly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "I told you, I don't have any." Eleanor studied him for a moment, sensing there was more to his story than he was letting on. She leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued. But you had someone once, didn't you? Someone who cared for you. He looked down at his hands, tracing the edge of his worn shirt. Yeah, he said quietly. My mom. Her name was Sarah. The name hit Eleanor like a sudden gust of wind. She blinked, leaning back against the sofa as a flood of memories surfaced. Sarah. It couldn't be the same Sarah. But the more she thought about it, the more the timelines and details began to align. Sarah had worked for her years ago as a housekeeper, kind, diligent, always smiling even when the weight of the world seemed to rest on her shoulders. She had been a fixture in Eleanor's life for a time, though Eleanor had paid her little mind beyond the professional capacity. Then one day, Sarah had left without explanation, leaving only a brief note of resignation. Eleanor hadn't thought much of it then, preoccupied as she was with her burgeoning career. Your mother, she said slowly. Did she ever work for someone in a house like this? Ethan glanced up, his brow furrowing. She worked for a lady. She said her name was Eleanor. The confirmation sent a jolt through her. Eleanor felt the weight of the revelation settle heavily in her chest. Sarah's sudden departure all those years ago had always been a small, unanswered question in the back of her mind. Now, it seemed, the answer had been sitting on the sidewalk in Manhattan just hours earlier. Ethan watched her carefully, his expression guarded. You knew her, didn't you? I did, Eleanor admitted, her voice quiet. She worked for me a long time ago. But I don't understand. Why didn't she ever tell me she had a son? Ethan shrugged, though there was a tension in his posture that suggested he knew more than he was saying. She didn't talk about it much. Just said she had to leave because it wasn't safe anymore. Not safe, Eleanor repeated, her confusion deepening. I don't know, Ethan said, shaking his head. She didn't explain it, but she said she had to protect me. Eleanor leaned back, her mind spinning with possibilities. What had happened to Sarah that had made her feel unsafe? And why hadn't she come to Eleanor for help? The questions gnawed at her, but she knew pressing Ethan for answers he didn't have would be pointless. Grace returned then, carrying a tray with a bowl of soup and a sandwich. She set it on the coffee table in front of Ethan, who murmured a quiet thank you before starting to eat. Eleanor watched him in silence, her thoughts racing. As the evening wore on, Ethan grew more comfortable, though he remained guarded. He answered her questions in short, factual sentences, revealing bits and pieces of his life, but withholding anything too personal. Eleanor found herself increasingly drawn to the puzzle of his existence, not just because of Sarah, but because of the resilience he seemed to carry so naturally. When it was time for him to sleep, Eleanor led him to one of the guest rooms. You'll stay here for now, she said, opening the door to reveal a neatly made bed and a small nightstand. If you need anything, let me know. Ethan nodded, stepping inside. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to say. Good night, she managed finally, before closing the door behind her. Back in her own room, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window at the sprawling lawn beyond. She thought about Sarah, her quiet kindness, her sudden departure, and now, the boy she had left behind. Ethan's presence had stirred something in her, something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a gnawing sense of responsibility, a feeling she didn't know what to do with yet. Eleanor reached for her phone, scrolling through old messages and emails, searching for anything that might give her a clue about Sarah's departure. But there was nothing, no hint, no explanation. She set the phone down with a sigh, her thoughts drifting back to the boys sleeping just down the hall. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the answers she sought were tangled in a web of secrets she was only beginning to uncover. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt a crack in the carefully constructed walls around her life. And for reasons she couldn't yet explain, she didn't want to close it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine marble floors of Eleanor Rivers' mansion. She sat at the head of the dining table, sipping her coffee and scrolling through emails on her tablet. Ethan was still asleep in the guest room, giving her a moment to regain her composure. But no matter how much she tried to focus on the mundane tasks of the day, her thoughts kept circling back to him and to Sarah. The idea that Sarah had worked for her, disappeared, and left behind a son without ever mentioning him gnawed at Eleanor. Her instincts told her there was more to the story, something buried deep in the past that she had been too distracted to notice. Her tablet pinged with a new email. It was from her assistant, marked urgent. The subject line read, "Irregularities in financial reports." Eleanor's brows knitted as she opened the email. The body of the message was short but unsettling. "Ms. Rivers, I've been reviewing some quarterly reports and noticed discrepancies in several transactions. Funds seem to have been diverted to accounts that aren't listed in our official records. I thought you should be aware before today's board meeting." Setting her coffee cup down, Eleanor leaned closer to the screen, her mind shifting gears. She tapped on the attached documents, scanning through rows of numbers and financial jargon. At first glance, it looked like minor errors, but the deeper she delved, the clearer the patterns became. Money had been siphoned off in small amounts over several months, carefully disguised to avoid detection. Her jaw tightened as she noticed a name associated with some of the questionable approvals: Richard Porter. Richard was her business partner and a longtime associate. Though competent and charismatic, he had always shown a flair for bending the rules to his advantage. Eleanor had dismissed his antics in the past, but this was different. These transactions weren't mistakes. They were deliberate. She grabbed her phone and called Mark. He picked up on the second ring. "Mark, how bad is it?" she asked, skipping formalities. "It's concerning," Mark admitted. "The amounts aren't huge, but they add up over time. And the accounts, well, they're offshore. Hard to trace unless you dig deeper." "And you're certain Richard's name is tied to these?" "Yes, ma'am. His signature's on several of the authorizations. But I think this could go deeper. These accounts don't look new. It's possible this has been happening for years." Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened. "Pull every file connected to these transactions. I want a full report by this afternoon." "Yes, ma'am." Ending the call, Eleanor stared at her tablet, her thoughts racing. If Richard was behind this, it wasn't just a breach of trust. It was a threat to the company she had spent years building. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his hair messy from sleep and his expression groggy. He rubbed his eyes as he approached the table. "Morning," he mumbled. "Good morning," Eleanor replied, softening her tone. "Did you sleep well?" He nodded, sliding into a chair across from her. "Yeah, your house is quiet, different from other places." Eleanor watched him for a moment, wondering how someone so young could carry himself with such composure. "Ethan," she began cautiously, "do you remember anything else your mother told you? About why she left?" Ethan looked down at the table, tracing patterns on the polished surface with his finger. "She didn't talk about it much," he said after a pause. "But I know she was scared. She said people couldn't be trusted, and she didn't want me to get hurt." The weight of his words hung in the air. Eleanor felt a pang of guilt. If Sarah had been scared while working for her, why hadn't she noticed? What had she missed? Did she ever mention anyone specific? Eleanor pressed. Ethan shrugged, just that someone was watching her. Eleanor's stomach churned. She had dismissed Sarah's departure as a personal choice, never considering that it might have been driven by fear. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her back to the present. It was a reminder for the afternoon board meeting. She glanced at the clock, realizing she had only a few hours to prepare. "Ethan," she said, standing, "I need to go into the office today. Grace will be here if you need anything." "Are you going to figure out what happened to my mom?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with quiet hope. Eleanor hesitated. "I'll do my best," she promised. The drive to her Manhattan office was filled with conflicting emotions. Eleanor was used to compartmentalizing, But Ethan's presence and the resurfacing memories of Sarah made it impossible to keep her focus solely on work. When she arrived at the sleek glass building that housed Rivers Enterprises, Mark was waiting for her in the lobby with a folder in hand. "Here's everything I've found so far," he said as they stepped into the elevator. Eleanor flipped through the pages, her frown deepening with each revelation. Not only were the financial discrepancies larger than she'd anticipated, but there were also notes about communication logs, emails that had been flagged or rerouted. "What's this?" she asked, holding up a printout of intercepted messages. "These are emails that were blocked or redirected," Mark explained. "I checked the sender. A few are from Sarah Walker." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Sarah Walker?" Mark nodded. "The timestamps show they were sent around the time she left, but none of them reached your inbox." Eleanor's mind reeled. Sarah had tried to contact her, but someone had ensured she couldn't. She scanned the emails, her breath catching at the subject lines. "I need to talk to you. It's urgent. Please help." Her pulse quickened as anger and guilt collided. Sarah had reached out, and Eleanor hadn't even known. "Who had the authority to block these?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Richard," Mark said grimly. He had access to all internal communications at the time. Eleanor's grip tightened on the folder. It was becoming clear that Richard wasn't just embezzling funds. He had played a role in silencing Sarah. The board meeting that afternoon felt more like a chess game. Richard, ever the charmer, opened with a presentation on streamlining operations and enhancing profitability. Eleanor watched him closely, her anger simmering beneath a calm exterior. When it was her turn to speak, she stood, holding the folder tightly in her hands. "Before we move forward with any plans," she began, "I think it's important to address some concerns." Richard's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Concerns? What kind of concern?" Eleanor set the folder on the table and opened it. "Financial discrepancies, unauthorized transactions, blocked communications, all tied back to you." The room went silent as she laid out the evidence piece by piece. Richard's charm began to crack as the weight of the accusations mounted. "These are baseless claims," he said, his voice rising. "You can't prove anything." "I can," Eleanor said firmly, "and I will." The meeting ended in tense silence, with Richard storming out and the board members exchanging uneasy glances. As Eleanor returned to her office, her phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "There's more to this than we thought. I'll keep digging." Eleanor sat at her desk, staring out at the city skyline. She felt the ground shifting beneath her, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let Richard get away with it, and she wasn't going to stop until she uncovered the truth about Sarah. The following day, Eleanor sat in her office, her fingers drumming lightly on the desk as she waited for Mark to arrive with updates. The events of the previous day played on a loop in her mind. Richard's smug dismissal of her accusations, the blocked emails from Sarah, and the lingering feeling that she was only beginning to scratch the surface of something far bigger. When Mark finally stepped in, carrying a slim box and a tablet, Eleanor sat up straighter. "I found something in the archives," he began, setting the box on her desk. "It took a while, but I managed to pull old employee records, including Sarah's. There's not much. Most of it is routine paperwork, but this was attached to her file." He slid a small, worn journal across the desk. Eleanor picked it up carefully, the faded leather cover soft under her fingers. The initials SW were etched into the bottom right corner. "She kept a journal?" Eleanor asked, her brow furrowing. "It looks like it," Mark said. "I also cross-checked the emails we recovered. They seem to match up with some of the dates in the journal." Eleanor opened the journal, her breath catching as she saw Sarah's familiar handwriting. The entries were brief but deeply personal, offering glimpses into her thoughts and fears during the time she had worked for Eleanor. The first few pages were mundane, detailing daily tasks and observations about the mansion. But as Eleanor flipped further, the tone shifted. "Something doesn't feel right. I've noticed someone watching me when I leave work. I thought it was my imagination at first, but it keeps happening. I don't want to worry Eleanor. She has enough on her plate, but I can't shake this feeling." Eleanor's stomach tightened as she read on. "I heard Richard in the study today. He didn't know I was nearby. He was on the phone, talking about something he called a contingency plan. I didn't hear much, but the way he said it scared me. I need to be careful." The entries became more fragmented, filled with cryptic notes and half-formed thoughts. Eleanor could feel Sarah's anxiety growing with each page, culminating in an entry that made her blood run cold. "I can't stay here anymore. It's not safe, not for me, not for Ethan. If anything happens, I hope Eleanor understands. I tried to tell her, but I think someone's intercepting my messages. I'll leave a note and pray she finds it. I have to protect my son." Eleanor closed the journal, her hands trembling. She looked at Mark, who had been watching her reaction closely. She was afraid, Eleanor said quietly. "Afraid of Richard." "It seems that way," Mark agreed. "And if Richard knew about Ethan, it might explain why Sarah felt she had to leave." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She thought back to the day Sarah had left, how sudden it had been, and how little she had questioned it at the time. Her guilt deepened as she realized just how blind she had been to the struggles of someone who had worked so closely with her. "Is there anything else?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Mark nodded and turned the tablet toward her. "I dug into the offshore accounts tied to Richard. There's one in particular that caught my attention. It's been active for years, but there was a significant withdrawal around the same time Sarah left. I can't prove it yet, but I think he might have used it to pay someone off." "Pay someone for what?" Eleanor asked, her tone sharp. "I don't know," Mark admitted, "but it's worth investigating." Eleanor's phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting their conversation. She glanced at the screen and saw Grace's name flashing. "Excuse me," she said, picking up the call. "Grace." "Ms. Rivers," Grace said, her voice tinged with concern. "I thought you should know. Ethan found something. He's been in the library all morning, going through old boxes. I think it's something you'll want to see." Eleanor ended the call and stood, grabbing the journal as she headed for the door. "Mark, keep digging. I need to go home." The drive back to the mansion felt interminable, her mind racing with questions. What had Ethan found? Was it another piece of Sarah's story? When she arrived, she found Ethan sitting cross-legged on the library floor, surrounded by an array of dusty boxes. He looked up as she entered, holding up a faded envelope. "I found this in one of the boxes," he said. "It's addressed to you." Eleanor approached cautiously, taking the envelope from his hands. Her name was scrawled across the front in Sarah's familiar handwriting. She opened it carefully, unfolding the letter inside. The paper was yellowed with age, but the words were clear. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means something went wrong. I've tried to reach you, but I don't know if my messages are getting through. I've done everything I can to protect Ethan, but I'm afraid it's not enough. There's someone you need to watch out for, Richard Porter. I don't know how far he's willing to go, but he's dangerous. I wish I could tell you everything in person, but I can't risk it. Please take care of my son. He's all I have. Sarah." Eleanor sank into a nearby chair, the weight of the letter pressing down on her. She felt Ethan's gaze on her and looked up to meet his eyes. "What does it say?" he asked softly. "It says your mother was trying to protect you," Eleanor replied, her voice thick with emotion, "and that she trusted me to do the same." Ethan's expression hardened slightly, his small hands clenching into fists. "Why didn't you help her?" The question hit Eleanor like a blow. "I didn't know," she said honestly. "I didn't see what was happening, and I'm so sorry for that." Ethan studied her for a moment before nodding, his posture relaxing. "What are you going to do now?" Eleanor looked at the letter again, her resolve hardening. "I'm going to make this right," she said, "for your mother and for you." The rest of the day was spent piecing together everything they had found. Eleanor and Ethan pored over the journal, the letter, and the emails, trying to connect the dots. The picture that emerged was damning. Richard had not only betrayed Eleanor professionally, but had also played a role in driving Sarah away and endangering her son. By nightfall, Eleanor stood in her office, staring out the window at the sprawling lawn. She held the journal in one hand and Sarah's letter in the other, her mind racing with plans. She had spent years building walls around herself, but now those walls were coming down. For the first time, she wasn't just fighting for her company. She was fighting for Sarah's memory and for the boy who had brought her back to life. As she closed the journal and set it on her desk, Eleanor knew one thing with absolute certainty. Richard Porter wasn't going to get away with it. Not this time. The tension in Eleanor's office was palpable as she sat at her desk, her eyes fixed on Sarah's journal and letter. Ethan's quiet breathing filled the room as he sat across from her, watching her expression shift between anger and determination. Eleanor's mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of Sarah's story with the mounting evidence against Richard Porter. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice calm but firm, "what you found here is important. It proves that your mother tried to warn me about Richard, but I need more to bring him down." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his youthful curiosity tempered by an almost uncanny maturity. "How are you going to find it?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "I'll start by going to the company records. If Richard has been hiding his actions, there will be a trail. People like him always leave one." The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the Sleek Rivers Enterprises building in Manhattan, her heels clicking purposefully on the polished floors. She felt the weight of what she was about to do, but it only strengthened her resolve. As she entered her office, Mark was already waiting for her, a stack of files in hand. "Good morning, Mark," Eleanor said briskly, setting her bag on the desk. "Morning, Ms. Rivers," Mark replied, handing her the files. "I've pulled all the documents tied to the accounts we discussed. There are discrepancies in almost every one of them." Eleanor flipped through the pages, her sharp eyes scanning the numbers and signatures. Each detail only deepened her suspicion. "Has anyone else seen these?" "No," Mark assured her. "I've been careful, but you should know, Richard's been asking questions. He knows we're looking into something." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Let him wonder," she said, closing the folder with a snap. "We need to stay ahead of him." By midday, Eleanor had enough evidence to build a solid case against Richard. The accounts he had been using to funnel money were tied to shell companies, each one meticulously created to mask the true recipient of the funds. But what caught her attention most was the timing. Several large transactions had occurred shortly after Sarah's resignation. Eleanor's stomach churned as she stared at the dates. It wasn't just a coincidence. Richard had made sure Sarah couldn't expose him, and when she became a risk, he had likely forced her out. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Richard, his usual smug smile plastered across his face. "Eleanor," he said smoothly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I was hoping we could talk." Eleanor folded her hands on the desk, her expression neutral. "What can I do for you, Richard?" Richard closed the door behind him, his gaze flickering briefly to the files on her desk before returning to her. "I've noticed some unusual activity lately. It seems like certain employees are digging through old accounts. Is there something I should be aware of?" Eleanor didn't flinch. "Just routine audits," she said coolly. "You know how important transparency is to me." Richard's smile tightened. "Of course, but transparency can be delicate. Sometimes, it's better not to dredge up old issues." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "Are you suggesting that I should ignore discrepancies in our financial records?" "Not at all," Richard replied, his tone light but his gaze hard. "I'm simply saying that we should focus on the future, not the past." Eleanor held his stare, the tension between them thickening. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice icy. Richard lingered for a moment longer, as if testing her resolve, before turning to leave. "Have a good day, Eleanor," he said over his shoulder. As the door clicked shut, Eleanor exhaled slowly, her fists clenching under the desk. She had no doubt that Richard was aware of her investigation, and his visit was a thinly veiled threat. But it only fueled her determination to expose him. That evening, Eleanor returned to the mansion, exhausted but energized by the progress she had made. Ethan was waiting for her in the library, flipping through one of the books he had found earlier. "Did you find anything?" he asked as she entered. "Yes," Eleanor replied, sitting down beside him. "Richard's been embezzling money for years, and I think he was behind your mother leaving." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Why would he do that?" "Because she knew too much," Eleanor said simply. "She tried to warn me, but he made sure her messages never reached me. He's dangerous, Ethan, but we're going to stop him." Ethan nodded, his small hands gripping the edges of the book. "What if he tries to hurt you?" Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I've dealt with people like Richard before. He's not going to win." The next morning, Eleanor met with her legal team, presenting the evidence she had gathered. The lawyers were grim but efficient, outlining the steps needed to take Richard down without jeopardizing the company. "This is enough to file a formal complaint," one of them said, sliding a stack of documents across the table. "But Richard will fight back. You'll need to be prepared for a legal battle." "I'm prepared," Eleanor said firmly. "I won't let him destroy what I built, or what Sarah tried to protect." That afternoon, Eleanor called a meeting with the board of directors. Richard was already there when she arrived, his confident demeanor unshaken. "Eleanor," he greeted her, his voice dripping with false charm. "I'm glad you called this meeting. I've been meaning to discuss some new strategies for the company." Eleanor ignored his words, taking her place at the head of the table. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady. "There's something urgent we need to address." She laid out the evidence piece by piece, her words slicing through the room like a scalpel. The board members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock as the magnitude of Richard's betrayal became clear. Richard's composure cracked as she presented the final piece, a record of the blocked emails from Sarah, proving that he had intercepted her attempts to warn Eleanor. "This is absurd," Richard snapped, rising to his feet. "You're grasping at straws, Eleanor. None of this proves anything." Eleanor stood, meeting his glare with unwavering resolve. "It proves enough, and the rest will come out when we take this to court." The board erupted into murmurs, their trust in Richard eroding with each passing second. One by one, they voiced their support for Eleanor, voting to suspend Richard pending a full investigation. As Richard stormed out of the room, Eleanor felt a surge of triumph, but she knew the battle wasn't over. She still had to uncover the full extent of his actions and ensure that justice was served, not just for herself, but for Sarah and Ethan. That night, as Eleanor sat in her office reviewing the day's events, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The walls she had built around herself were crumbling, and in their place, she was building something stronger, a legacy of truth and accountability. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression hesitant. "Are you okay?" he asked. Eleanor smiled, motioning for him to join her. "I'm more than okay," she said. "We're one step closer to the truth." Ethan climbed into the chair beside her, his small frame dwarfed by the desk. Together, they pored over the documents late into the night, determined to uncover every secret Richard had tried to bury. Eleanor awoke to the soft knock on her bedroom door. Grace, her housekeeper, stood there with an uneasy expression. "Ms. Rivers, I think you should come downstairs," Grace said cautiously. Eleanor glanced at the clock. It was earlier than usual, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. "What is it?" "It's Ethan," Grace replied. "He's gone." Eleanor's heart sank. She threw on a robe and followed Grace downstairs. Ethan's absence wasn't immediately alarming. He often wandered the house, curious about its many rooms. But as she entered the living room, She noticed his backpack missing from the corner where he usually kept it. "When did you last see him?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharper than intended. "Last night," Grace said. "He was in the library. I thought he went to bed afterward." Eleanor's mind raced. She checked the kitchen, the garden, and even the small sitting room Ethan liked to use. But there was no sign of him. A note on the dining table caught her eye. She unfolded the paper, her pulse quickening as she read the scrawled handwriting. "I need to find answers. Don't worry about me." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Grace, call security. Tell them to check the perimeter and the nearby streets." He couldn't have gone far. "Yes, ma'am," Grace said, hurrying off. Eleanor sat down, clutching the note. She had known Ethan was restless, that the weight of his mother's story lingered heavily on him, but she hadn't expected him to leave without telling her. Her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Mark. "Ms. Rivers," he said quickly. "I have more updates on Richard. There's a connection I think you need to see." Eleanor rubbed her temples. "Not now, Mark. Ethan's gone." "What do you mean gone?" "He left a note. He's looking for something. I don't know where." There was a pause before Mark replied. "You mentioned he grew up in an orphanage, right? Do you think he went back there?" Eleanor's eyes widened. "The orphanage? It made sense. I'll check. Thank you, Mark." She grabbed her coat and keys, her mind racing as she headed to the car. The drive to the orphanage felt agonizingly slow. The building came into view, a modest structure nestled on the edge of town. It was smaller than she had imagined, its faded exterior reflecting years of wear and limited resources. Eleanor parked and hurried inside, where a woman at the front desk looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. "I'm looking for a boy," Eleanor said, her tone urgent. "His name is Ethan. He may have come here this morning." The woman frowned. "I haven't seen anyone, but let me check the grounds." Eleanor waited, pacing the small lobby. Minutes felt like hours until the woman returned, shaking her head. "No sign of him," she said. Eleanor thanked her and stepped outside, frustration bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She scanned the area, her gaze catching on a figure sitting on a bench near the back of the property. Relief washed over her as she recognized Ethan, his small frame hunched over something in his lap. "Ethan," she called, striding toward him. He looked up, startled, but didn't move. As she approached, she saw he was holding an envelope, its edges worn from age. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor asked, kneeling beside him. "I needed to find this," Ethan said, holding up the envelope. It was in the director's office. Eleanor took the envelope, her breath catching as she saw her name scrawled on the front. She opened it carefully, pulling out a letter written in Sarah's familiar handwriting. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means Ethan has found his way to you. I wish I could have told you everything in person, but I was afraid. Richard Porter is dangerous, and I couldn't risk staying. I did what I thought was best for Ethan, but I know it wasn't enough. Please, take care of him. Protect him in ways I couldn't. And if you can, find out the truth. There's more to this than even I understood. Thank you, Eleanor, for everything." Sarah. Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes as she folded the letter, her heart heavy with guilt and resolve. "Your mother trusted me," she said softly. "I won't let her down again." Ethan looked at her, his expression serious. "She wanted you to know the truth." Eleanor nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And we're going to find it, together." They drove back to the mansion in silence, the weight of Sarah's letter hanging over them. As they entered the house, Eleanor's phone buzzed again. It was Mark. "Ms. Rivers, I found another connection," Mark said. "Richard made payments to someone at the orphanage years ago, shortly after Sarah left. I think it might be related to why she felt unsafe." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "Who?" "I'm still digging, but the amounts are significant, enough to make someone stay quiet." "Keep looking," Eleanor said, her voice firm. That evening, Eleanor and Ethan sat together in the library, going through Sarah's journal and the new letter. Each piece of information painted a clearer picture. Sarah had uncovered something about Richard, something big enough to put her and Ethan in danger. She wrote about him, Ethan said, pointing to an entry in the journal. She said he was watching her. Eleanor read the passage, her anger simmering. Richard had manipulated her company and driven Sarah into hiding, all while keeping Eleanor in the dark. "We need more," Eleanor said. "Something concrete to tie him to this." Ethan hesitated before pulling out another envelope from his backpack. "I found this too," he said quietly. Eleanor opened it, revealing old photographs of Sarah, Ethan as a baby, and a man she didn't recognize. The man was standing next to Richard in one of the photos, their expression serious. "Who is this?" Eleanor asked, showing the photo to Ethan. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but I've seen him before. He worked at the orphanage." Eleanor's mind raced. The man in the photo was the missing link, someone who could tie Richard's actions to Sarah's departure. "I'll find him," Eleanor said, her resolve hardening. As the night wore on, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. With Ethan by her side and Sarah's letters guiding her, she was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The battle against Richard was far from over, but Eleanor knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't stop until she had justice for Sarah and a safe future for Ethan. The missing pieces were falling into place, and for the first time, she felt the momentum shifting in her favor. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Eleanor's mansion, casting a warm glow across the library where she sat with Ethan. The journal, letters, and photographs lay spread across the table between them. Eleanor sipped her coffee, her eyes scanning the photo of Richard standing beside the unidentified man. "Mark is looking into this man," she said, her voice steady. "If we can connect him to the payments Richard made to the orphanage, it could be the breakthrough we need." Ethan nodded, though his gaze lingered on a photo of his mother holding him as a baby. Her expression was soft, her smile radiant. "She looks so happy here," he murmured. Eleanor reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "She loved you more than anything. That's clear in every word she wrote." Ethan gave her a small smile, but there was a weight in his eyes that Eleanor recognized, an ache for something irretrievably lost. The sound of the front door opening pulled her attention. Grace entered the library, carrying a box. "This just arrived, Ms. Rivers," she said, setting it on the table. Eleanor opened the box, revealing documents and a stack of old files. On top was a note from Mark. "Found this in the archives. Thought it might help." She pulled out the files, flipping through them quickly. One caught her eye, a report on a property acquisition made years ago under a shell company. The name on the file matched the one associated with Richard's offshore accounts. "What is it?" Ethan asked, peering over the edge of the table. "A property," Eleanor said, frowning. "Bought under one of Richard's fake companies. If this was around the time your mother left." Eleanor trailed off, her mind piecing together the implications. She turned to Grace. "Tell Mark to meet me at the office. I need him to pull everything we have on this property." Grace nodded and left the room. Eleanor stood, gathering the documents and slipping them into her bag. "Ethan, stay here with Grace. I'll be back soon." Ethan's brows furrowed. "What if you find something? Then we'll deal with it," Eleanor said firmly. The drive to the office felt tense. Eleanor's thoughts swirled as she considered the growing mountain of evidence against Richard. The property acquisition could be the missing piece, a physical location tied to his fraudulent activities. Mark was waiting in her office when she arrived, a stack of papers already spread out on the desk. "I cross-referenced the property," he began, motioning for Eleanor to sit. "It's an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The records show minimal activity, but there were security payments listed under the same shell company. It looks like someone was keeping an eye on the place. Could it be connected to Sarah?" Eleanor asked. Mark hesitated. "It's possible. The timing lines up. If Sarah discovered something about this warehouse, it could explain why she felt unsafe. Eleanor's grip on the armrest tightened. "Have you been there?" "No," Mark said, "but I can arrange for someone to check it out." "No," Eleanor said quickly. "I'll go myself." "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Mark asked, concern etched on his face. "I need to see it," Eleanor said, her voice resolute. "This is personal, Mark. I can't delegate it." Later that afternoon, Eleanor drove to the warehouse, her heart pounding as she approached the nondescript building. Its exterior was weathered, with rusted metal doors and faded paint. She parked a distance away, taking in her surroundings before stepping out of the car. The air was thick with silence as she approached the building. She pushed open one of the creaking doors, the sound echoing through the empty space. Inside, the warehouse was vast but nearly barren, save for a few scattered crates and a desk in one corner. Eleanor walked cautiously, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. She reached the desk and saw a folder lying open. The papers inside were old and yellowed, but one document caught her attention: a ledger with names and numbers. Her breath hitched as she scanned the page. One of the names stood out: Sarah Walker. Beside it was a date and an amount of money. Eleanor's stomach churned. This was it, a record proving Sarah's connection to Richard's activities. But what did the payment mean? A noise behind her made her freeze. She turned quickly, her pulse racing. "Eleanor," a familiar voice drawled. Richard stood in the doorway, his expression calm but his eyes cold. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor demanded, clutching the folder. "I could ask you the same thing," Richard replied, stepping closer. "This is private property. Trespassing, even for you, is a bad look." Eleanor straightened, meeting his gaze. "What's this, Richard?" she asked, holding up the folder. "Why is Sarah Walker's name in your records?" Richard's smile faltered briefly before returning. "That's none of your concern." "It's entirely my concern," Eleanor snapped. "She worked for me. She tried to warn me about you, and you made sure she couldn't." Richard's expression darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," Eleanor said, stepping closer. "I know you paid someone to keep quiet. I know you drove Sarah away because she knew too much. And I know you've been stealing from the company for years." Richard's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor." "No," she said firmly. "You did, and now you're going to pay for it." Richard stared at her for a long moment before turning and walking out, his footsteps echoing in the empty warehouse. Eleanor's hands shook as she clutched the folder, but her resolve was stronger than ever. Back at the mansion, Ethan was waiting anxiously in the library. When Eleanor walked in, he rushed to meet her. "Did you find something?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, handing him the folder. "This is part of it," she said. "Your mother's name is in these records. She was trying to protect you." Ethan's hands trembled as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. Why would he do this? "Because she knew too much," Eleanor said. "And now, we know enough to stop him." That night, Eleanor sat at her desk, reviewing everything she had gathered. The pieces were falling into place, each one pointing to Richard's guilt. Ethan appeared in the doorway, holding Sarah's journal. "Do you think she would be proud?" he asked softly. Eleanor looked up, her expression softening. "I think she'd be proud of both of us," she said. Ethan smiled faintly, stepping into the room. He placed the journal on the desk and sat beside her. As they worked together, piecing together the puzzle of Sarah's legacy, Eleanor felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about justice. It was about honoring Sarah's memory and ensuring Ethan had the future his mother had dreamed of. The battle was far from over, but Eleanor was ready. For the first time, she felt she was fighting for something that truly mattered. Eleanor sat in the dim light of her office, the clock ticking softly in the background. The folder from the warehouse lay open on her desk, Its contents spread before her like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. She'd spent hours poring over the documents, each one revealing more of Richard's tangled web of deceit. The ledger with Sarah's name burned in her mind. It wasn't just a record. It was a clue to understanding why Sarah had been forced to flee. Across the room, Ethan sat on the couch, flipping through his mother's journal for the 100th time. He looked up at Eleanor, his small face shadowed with worry. "Do you think he'll come after us?" he asked, his voice quiet. Eleanor set down her pen and turned toward him. "Richard knows we're on to him," she admitted. "But he also knows I won't back down. Whatever happens, Ethan, I'll protect you. I promise." Ethan nodded, though the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. "He was at the orphanage once," he said suddenly. Eleanor blinked. "What do you mean?" "I saw him," Ethan said. "When I was little, he came to talk to the director, but I didn't know who he was back then." The revelation hit Eleanor like a jolt. Richard's connection to the orphanage was deeper than she'd realized. "Do you remember anything they talked about?" Ethan shook his head. "No." But he looked mad, and the director was nervous. "I didn't see him again after that." Eleanor's mind raced. If Richard had been involved with the orphanage, it could explain the payments and the secrecy surrounding Sarah's departure. She picked up her phone and called Mark, who answered almost immediately. "Mark, I need you to look into the orphanage records," she said. "Specifically, anything tied to the director and Richard Porter." "I'm on it," Mark replied without hesitation. Eleanor ended the call and turned back to Ethan. "If Richard was connected to the orphanage, we need to find out why," she said. Hours later, Mark arrived at the mansion with a thick file in hand. His expression was grim as he set it on Eleanor's desk. "I pulled everything I could find," he said, flipping open the file. Richard made regular payments to the orphanage under one of his shell companies. The records don't specify what the payments were for, but the amounts were significant. And then there's this. He slid a document across the desk. Eleanor picked it up, her eyes narrowing as she read. It was a report from the orphanage's director, dated shortly after Sarah left. "The situation has been resolved. Ms. Walker is no longer a concern. The boy will remain here as instructed." Eleanor's breath caught. "They were trying to keep Ethan away from Sarah," she murmured. Mark nodded. "It looks like Richard was involved in ensuring Sarah wouldn't come back for him. But why would he go to such lengths?" Eleanor's mind churned. What if Sarah found out something about Richard's operations? Something that put her life in danger, and Ethan's too. Mark hesitated. "There's one more thing," he said, pulling out a photograph. It was old and grainy, showing a group of people standing outside the warehouse Eleanor had visited. Among them were Richard and the man from the photo Ethan had recognized. "That's him," Ethan said, pointing to the man, "the one from the orphanage." Eleanor studied the photograph, her pulse quickening. The man wasn't just a random figure. He was a key player in Richard's scheme. "We need to find him," Eleanor said. "If he worked with Richard, he might know everything." Mark nodded. "I'll start searching." That evening, Eleanor sat with Ethan in the library, her thoughts heavy with the day's discoveries. "Your mother did everything she could to protect you," she said softly, "even when it cost her everything." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Do you think she was scared?" Eleanor hesitated. "I think she was brave," she said finally. "She faced things most people couldn't, all to make sure you were safe." Ethan reached for her hand, his grip small but strong. "Thank you for helping me," he said. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "I'm not just helping you, Ethan. I'm helping her too." The next morning, Mark called with news. "We found him," he said. "The man in the photo. His name is Victor Kane. He worked as a consultant for Richard years ago and was listed as a donor for the orphanage." "Where is he now?" Eleanor asked. "Living in a small town upstate," Mark replied. "I have the address." Eleanor wasted no time. She packed a bag and prepared to leave, telling Grace to watch over Ethan while she was gone. "Where are you going?" Ethan asked, watching her from the doorway. "To find answers," Eleanor said. "Stay here with Grace. I'll be back soon." The drive to Victor Kane's home was long and tense. The small town was quiet, its streets lined with modest houses. Eleanor found Victor's address, a weathered bungalow with an overgrown lawn. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding. After a moment, it creaked open, revealing a man in his 60s with tired eyes and a wary expression. "Victor Kane?" Eleanor asked. "Who's asking?" he replied, his voice gruff. "My name is Eleanor Rivers. I need to talk to you about Richard Porter and Sarah Walker." Victor's expression darkened, but he stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. The interior of the house was cluttered but clean, the air heavy with the scent of old books and coffee. "What do you want to know?" Victor asked, sitting heavily in a worn armchair. Eleanor sat across from him, her gaze steady. "I know you work with Richard. I know you were involved with the orphanage. And I know Sarah Walker tried to expose him." Victor sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You're not wrong," he said. "Richard paid me to keep tabs on Sarah. She'd stumbled onto something, one of his offshore accounts. She didn't know what it meant, but Richard panicked. He thought she'd figure it out, so he made sure she couldn't." Eleanor's stomach turned. "What did he do?" "He threatened her," Victor admitted. "Said he'd take Ethan away if she didn't leave. When she refused, he paid the orphanage director to make sure she couldn't come back for him." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. "And you helped him?" Victor looked away, shame flickering across his face. "I didn't know how far it would go. By the time I realized, it was too late." Eleanor stood, her voice cold. "It's not too late to make this right. Tell me everything you know." Victor hesitated, then nodded. "I'll tell you," he said, "but you'll need more than my word to take Richard down." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I'll get it, and when I do, he won't get away with this." As she left Victor's house, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. With Victor's testimony and the evidence she'd already gathered, Richard's empire of lies was beginning to crumble. Back at the mansion, Ethan was waiting anxiously by the window. When Eleanor walked through the door, he ran to meet her. "Did you find him?" he asked. "I did," Eleanor said, pulling him into a hug. "And he told me everything." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes wide with hope. "So we can stop Richard?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "We will. Together." Eleanor stood in the center of her office, surrounded by piles of documents, photographs, and notes. The air was heavy with tension as she reviewed everything she and Mark had gathered. Victor Kane's confession had opened the door to Richard's darkest secrets, and the evidence was beginning to paint a damning picture. She glanced at her phone, which buzzed with a new message from Mark. "Preliminary draft of Victor's testimony is ready. Meet me in the office." Eleanor grabbed her bag and the documents she planned to bring. As she turned to leave, she saw Ethan standing in the doorway, his face pale but resolute. "You're going after him, aren't you?" he asked. "I am," Eleanor said, walking toward him. "We have enough now to confront him, but it won't be easy." Ethan hesitated before stepping closer. "What if he tries to hurt you or make you stop?" Eleanor knelt to his level, placing her hands on his shoulders. "He's already tried to stop me, but I won't let him win. And I promise you, Ethan, I won't let him hurt us." Ethan nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, "but be careful." Eleanor smiled faintly and gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before heading out. At the Rivers Enterprises building, Mark was waiting in the conference room. The draft testimony and additional evidence spread across the large table. "I had Victor sign an affidavit," Mark said, pointing to a notarized document. "It details everything: his role in the orphanage, the payments Richard made, and Sarah's attempts to expose him." Eleanor scanned the testimony, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This is enough to start a formal case against him," she said. Mark nodded. "The lawyers are ready, but Richard isn't going to back down without a fight." Eleanor sat down, organizing the files. Let him fight. We have the truth on our side. As they finalized their plan, Eleanor's assistant poked her head into the room. Ms. Rivers, Mr. Porter is here to see you. Should I send him in? Eleanor exchanged a glance with Mark before nodding. Let him in, she said, her voice steady. Moments later, Richard strode into the room, his usual air of confidence clouded by a subtle wariness. He glanced at the documents on the table, but kept his expression neutral. Eleanor, he said smoothly, taking a seat across from her, I heard you've been busy. You could say that, Eleanor replied coolly, sliding a folder toward him. We've uncovered some interesting information. Care to explain this? Richard opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. His jaw tightened as he realized what he was looking at. Victor's testimony, financial records, and the ledger from the warehouse. This is a witch hunt, Richard said, tossing the folder back onto the table. None of this proves anything. It proves enough, Eleanor countered. Victor has admitted to everything. We have a signed affidavit, and the financial records trace back to you. You've been stealing from the company, manipulating people, and silencing anyone who got in your way, including Sarah. Richard's composure cracked. Sarah was meddling in things she didn't understand, he snapped. I did what I had to do to protect this company. Don't you dare use that excuse, Eleanor said, her voice sharp. You didn't protect the company. You protected yourself, and you destroyed lives in the process. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. You think you're so righteous, Eleanor. But this isn't just about me, is it? You're trying to make up for your own failures. You ignored Sarah when she needed you most. The word stung, but Eleanor didn't flinch. You're right, she said. I failed her, but I won't fail Ethan, and I won't let you get away with this. The room fell silent, the tension thick. Finally, Richard stood, his expression dark. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, he said. If you come after me, I'll make sure you lose everything. Eleanor rose to meet his glare, her voice calm but firm. I've already lost too much because of you. I'm not afraid of losing more, but you should be. Richard's mouth twitched as if he wanted to say more, but he turned and walked out without another word. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That went about as well as expected, he muttered. He's desperate, Eleanor said, sitting back down. Desperate people make mistakes. We just have to stay ahead of him. Later that evening, back at the mansion, Eleanor found Ethan in the library, flipping through Sarah's journal again. He looked up as she entered, his eyes searching hers. Did you talk to him? He asked. I did, Eleanor said, sitting beside him. And he knows we're coming for him. Ethan nodded, but his expression remained tense. What if he tries to stop us? He'll try, Eleanor admitted. But we have the truth, Ethan, and the truth is more powerful than anything he can do. Ethan closed the journal, his small hands resting on the cover. I just want him to pay for what he did to my mom. Eleanor wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close. He will, she said softly. I promise you he will. The next morning, Eleanor met with her legal team to finalize their strategy. The lawyers were confident that the evidence would hold up in court, but they warned Eleanor to prepare for backlash. Richard has connections, one of them said. He's not going to go down quietly. I'm not looking for quiet, Eleanor said. I'm looking for justice. As the team left the room, Mark approached her with an update. I've been keeping an eye on Richard's movements, he said. He's been meeting with some of his old contacts. I think he's trying to cover his tracks. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Let him try, she said. It won't save him. That afternoon, Eleanor received a call from the private investigator she'd hired weeks ago to look into Richard's offshore accounts. Ms. Rivers, I've uncovered a series of transactions linked to a new account, the investigator said. It looks like he's funneling money out of the country. He might be preparing to leave. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Send me everything you have, she said. Within minutes, the documents arrived in her inbox. As she reviewed them, her anger boiled over. Richard wasn't just trying to save himself. He was planning to flee, taking everything he could with him. Eleanor called Mark. "We need to act now," she said. "If Richard disappears, we'll lose our chance to hold him accountable." Mark agreed, and together they contacted the authorities, providing them with the evidence of Richard's financial crimes. By the end of the day, the wheels were in motion, warrants were issued, and Richard's accounts were flagged. It was only a matter of time before he was brought to justice. That evening, as Eleanor sat with Ethan in the library, she felt a sense of calm for the first time in weeks. The battle wasn't over, but the tide was turning in their favor. "Do you think it's enough?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet. Eleanor looked down at him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "It's more than enough," she said, "and we won't stop until he's held accountable." Ethan nodded, his trust in her unwavering. As they sat together, the shadows of the past seemed to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of hope. Eleanor knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt they were close to finding the justice Sarah deserved. The morning sun crept over the Manhattan skyline as Eleanor stood on the balcony of her mansion, sipping her coffee and watching the city come alive. Today was the day everything would come to a head. The legal wheels were already turning. Warrants had been issued, and the authorities were ready to confront Richard Porter. Eleanor took a deep breath, letting the weight of the past few weeks settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just about exposing Richard anymore. It was about honoring Sarah's courage and protecting Ethan's future. As she turned to head inside, she found Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of curiosity and resolve. "Are they going to arrest him today?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet but steady. "Yes," Eleanor said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "They have everything they need. It's only a matter of time now." Ethan nodded, his small hands gripping the edges of his sweater. "I hope he gets what he deserves." "He will," Eleanor promised. "And after today, we can finally start moving forward." A short while later, Eleanor arrived at the Rivers Enterprises building, where Mark was already waiting in her office. His face was pale, but his eyes were sharp with determination. "It's happening," he said as Eleanor stepped inside. "The authorities have frozen his accounts and flagged his properties. They'll move in as soon as he makes his next move." Eleanor sat down, her heart pounding. "Do we know where he is now?" "He was last seen at his townhouse," Mark said, pulling up a live feed on his tablet. "But he's been unusually quiet. My guess is he's planning to run." Eleanor's stomach churned. "We can't let that happen," she said firmly. "If he disappears, we lose everything." Mark nodded. "The team is ready. They'll intercept him if he tries." The tension in the room was palpable as Eleanor and Mark waited for updates. Every second felt like an eternity until, finally, Mark's phone buzzed. He answered quickly, his expression unreadable as he listened to the caller. When he hung up, he turned to Eleanor, his face breaking into a small smile. "They got him," he said. "Richard was caught trying to board a private plane. He's in custody." Relief flooded Eleanor's chest, but it was tempered by the knowledge of what came next. "And the evidence?" she asked. "Strong enough to hold him," Mark replied. "The embezzlement charges alone will keep him behind bars for years. And with Victor's testimony, it's airtight." Eleanor nodded, her mind already moving to the next steps. "We need to make a statement," she said. "The board and the public need to know the truth." Mark agreed, and together they crafted a press release detailing Richard's arrest and the company's commitment to transparency and justice. Later that afternoon, Eleanor stood in the company's main conference room, addressing the board of directors. The atmosphere was tense, but Eleanor's voice was steady as she laid out the facts. "Richard Porter betrayed this company, its employees, and its mission," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "But thanks to the efforts of our team, we've uncovered the truth and ensured that justice will be served." The board members nodded in agreement, their trust in Eleanor evident. As the meeting adjourned, Eleanor felt a sense of accomplishment, but her thoughts drifted back to Ethan and Sarah. She had achieved one part of her goal, but there was still more to do. That evening, Eleanor returned to the mansion, where Ethan was waiting anxiously in the living room. When she walked in, he ran to her, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Did they get him?" he asked. "They did," Eleanor said, kneeling to his level. "He's not going to hurt anyone else, Ethan. It's over." Ethan's face broke into a small smile, and he hugged her tightly. "Thank you," he whispered. Eleanor held him close, her own tears threatening to spill over. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "This was for you and for your mom." The days that followed were a whirlwind of media coverage, legal proceedings, and corporate restructuring. Eleanor worked tirelessly to ensure that Rivers Enterprises emerged stronger, while also focusing on her promise to Ethan. One afternoon, as she and Ethan sat in the library, he handed her a piece of paper. "I wrote something," he said shyly. Eleanor unfolded the paper and read it carefully. It was a letter addressed to Sarah, written in Ethan's neat, childlike handwriting. "Dear Mom, I miss you every day, but I hope you're proud of me. Ms. Eleanor has been taking care of me, just like you wanted. She's really strong, and I think you like her. I promise I'll keep trying to be brave, just like you were. Love, Ethan." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she folded the letter. "She would be so proud of you, Ethan," she said softly. "And I'm proud of you too." Ethan smiled, his eyes shining with gratitude. Over the weeks that followed, Eleanor began transforming her mansion into something new, a place where children like Ethan could find safety, love, and hope. She hired a team of architects and designers to reimagine the space, creating bright, welcoming rooms filled with books, art, and opportunities for growth. One evening, as the renovations were underway, Ethan found her sitting in the garden, a stack of Sarah's letters in her lap. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sitting beside her. "About your mom," Eleanor said, "and about how much she's inspired me. She never gave up, even when things were hardest. I want to make sure her legacy lives on." Ethan nodded, leaning against her. "I think she liked that." Months later, the mansion opened its doors to its first group of children, each one bringing their own story of resilience and hope. Ethan took on the role of an older brother to the newcomers, helping them adjust and sharing his own experiences. The day of the grand opening, Eleanor stood on the front steps of the mansion, addressing a crowd of supporters, donors, and community members. "This place is more than just a home," she said. "It's a promise that no child will face the world alone. Sarah Walker taught me that strength comes from love and compassion, and this is my way of honoring her legacy." As the crowd erupted into applause, Eleanor glanced at Ethan, who stood beside her with a proud smile. That night, as the mansion buzzed with the laughter of children and the warmth of a new beginning, Eleanor sat at her desk and opened Sarah's journal. She added one final entry. "Sarah, today we open the doors to something beautiful, something built on your strength and love. Your son is safe, and your story will never be forgotten. Thank you for trusting me. I promise to carry your legacy forward always." Eleanor closed the journal, placing it on the shelf beside the books Ethan had chosen for the new library. As she stepped into the hallway, the sound of laughter filled the air, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt truly at peace. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a legacy of hope had been born. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care